Something changed behind palace doors, and royal fans could feel it before a single headline tried to explain it. It was there in the silence, in the strange delay before the usual smiles appeared, in the careful distance between people who normally know exactly where to stand and exactly what to say. The palace did not announce a crisis. It did something far more unsettling. It carried on as if nothing had happened at all, and that was the first sign that something had. By dawn, the courtyard was already stirring with cars, security staff, and aides moving at a pace that looked controlled from a distance but tense up close. Nobody was running. Nobody was shouting, yet every movement seemed sharpened by the kind of urgency that only exists when an institution is trying not to look alarmed. For royal watchers, that contrast was impossible to ignore. This was not chaos, this was choreography under pressure. Inside, long before the cameras gathered at the gates, a closed-door meeting had begun in one of the smaller drawing rooms away from the grand ceremonial spaces the public associates with palace life. No glittering hall, no public splendor, no rows of diplomatic guests, just thick curtains, polished wood, low voices, and the sort of atmosphere that turns ordinary conversation into something heavier. The people called into that room were not random. They were the figures who appear when a routine matter stops being routine and starts becoming dangerous. One senior aide arrived carrying a red leather folder pressed so tightly beneath his arm that even seasoned staff noticed. Another entered without the usual briefing papers, suggesting that whatever was being discussed had outrun the normal chain of preparation. Then came a pause, not a long one, but long enough for everyone outside the room to understand that someone important had not yet taken their seat. In palaces, timing is language, delay is language, absence is language, and on this morning the language felt louder than words. What happened next was not seen by the public, but its effects were. A scheduled appearance was suddenly described as under review. A secondary engagement vanished from the official list without explanation. Calls that usually moved through private offices with effortless smoothness began taking longer than expected. One household source, careful with every syllable, would later describe the mood as serious but contained. That choice of words did not calm anyone. It did the opposite. When institutions choose contained, it usually means they are holding something in. By midday, the first photographs emerged, and they only deepened the mystery. Faces looked composed, but not relaxed. Gestures were polite, but noticeably cooler. One figure who normally leaned in for a brief word before stepping forward stayed half a pace back. Another, known for effortless public warmth, seemed to speak with unusual precision, as though every sentence had been weighed before it left the mouth. To the casual eye, nothing was wrong. To people who watched this family closely, everything was different. Royal audiences are trained, almost unconsciously, to notice detail: a glance withheld, a smile shortened, a change in seating, an unexpected order of arrival. That is why speculation began spreading so quickly, not because anyone had proof of a dramatic rupture, but because the palace itself seemed to be sending out fragments of a story it was not ready to tell. And when the palace goes quiet, the smallest details become thunder. The deeper question was not whether something had happened. It was what kind of thing forces a family so practiced in appearance to tighten every visible seam at once. Was it a disagreement over strategy, a clash over timing, a personal confrontation that spilled into official space, or something even more sensitive, involving the future shape of the institution itself? Behind the gates, those possibilities are never equal. Some can be managed with a statement. Others change relationships for months. There had been warning signs, though most people only recognized them in hindsight. Over the previous week, several moments had passed that seemed minor at the time: a public remark that sounded flatter than expected, an appearance that ended faster than usual, a report that one conversation had run significantly longer than planned. On their own, those details meant nothing. Together, they began to look like pressure building under a polished surface. And then there was the matter of who had been seen entering through a side corridor, usually reserved for private movement within the residence. That single detail lit up royal forums within minutes. People who follow the palace closely know that side corridors matter because they often reveal who is being shielded from notice and who is being moved quickly between rooms without public visibility. It did not prove scandal. It did suggest sensitivity. In royal life, sensitivity is often the bridge between rumor and reality. By late afternoon, the tone had shifted again. Staff who had appeared tense in the morning now looked guarded, which is not the same thing. Tension means something may still be unfolding. Guarded means decisions have begun to harden. Somewhere behind those doors, lines were being drawn, language was being agreed, and someone was almost certainly deciding what the public could be allowed to see. That decision matters more than most viewers realize, because the palace rarely fights panic with truth alone. It fights panic with sequence, first posture, then message, then appearance. That is why the lack of immediate clarity felt so significant. If this had been minor, the palace could have smoothed it away before lunch. Instead, the silence stretched, not empty silence, but curated silence, the kind that invites questions while pretending to rise above them. For fans, that was the most unnerving part. The mystery did not feel accidental, it felt managed. And once a mystery starts looking managed, people stop asking what happened and start asking who needed the silence most. That is when royal mystery becomes a battle over control. By evening, the palace looked serene from the outside. The lights glowed warmly behind tall windows, the flags held steady in the cooling air, and the stream of official cars had slowed to the measured rhythm expected of any important residents preparing for the next day. But serenity, when too perfect, can be its own form of disguise. Behind the stone walls, the atmosphere had changed from uncertainty to calculation, and that shift was clearer than any shouted argument could have been. In private institutions built on hierarchy, the first real crisis is rarely the event itself. It is the moment everyone involved begins to understand what the event means. That moment appeared to arrive sometime after the midday meeting, when conversations were quietly collapsed into one strategy. Doors that usually stayed open were closed. Aides who worked for different senior figures began crossing paths more often than normal. Even the staff assigned to ceremonial preparation seemed to sense that the palace was no longer merely preparing appearances, it was protecting positions. One of the clearest signs came from a change so small most casual observers would never notice it. A senior member of staff who ordinarily acted as the informal bridge between households stopped moving freely between offices and began waiting to be called. That is not an administrative detail, that is a temperature reading. It means access has become sensitive, it means words are being rationed, it means trust, even if only temporarily, has thinned. The whispers that followed were impossible to verify, but they all revolved around the same idea. Something had happened in a private exchange that forced several people to reassess where they stood. Not a theatrical collapse, not some dramatic scene worthy of a tabloid front page, but something colder and in some ways more serious, a conversation after which nothing could simply return to normal. Those are the moments palaces fear most because they cannot be handled with ceremony. They have to be survived. The public often imagines royal difficulty as emotional, full of tears, slammed doors, and obvious bitterness. The harder truth is that royal conflict is often formal. It arrives in altered wording, in reworked schedules, in who is briefed first and who is informed later. It reveals itself when invitations are delayed, when a proposed appearance is no longer described as appropriate, when one version of events begins forming in one office while another takes shape elsewhere. That kind of conflict does not explode. It settles like frost. By then, the internal question was no longer whether the palace could contain the immediate tension. The question was whether the people at the center of it still wanted the same outcome. That distinction matters. A shared desire for calm can repair almost anything. A shared desire for control can harden almost everything. And judging by the unusual stillness inside the building, control had become the instinct. Outside the gates, the crowd had grown. Some had come with cameras, some with curiosity, and some with ritual loyalty that surrounds royal households in moments of uncertainty. They were watching for movement, for cars, for curtains shifting, for any sign that the people inside still understood how to present unity. But unity, when strained, has its own body language. It becomes less fluid, less spontaneous, less convincing. Even before night settled, that change had begun to show. A photograph taken at a distance captured two senior figures emerging into view, separated by little more than a few steps, yet appearing miles apart in tone. Neither looked openly distressed, neither broke protocol. That was exactly why the image spread so quickly. Viewers projected onto it what the palace refused to clarify. Some saw weariness, others saw caution. The most attentive saw something more telling than either: restraint under pressure. A family can fake ease for a few seconds. It struggles to fake ease when every person in the frame knows the image will be examined for meaning. The most persistent theory centered on a disagreement over direction. Not private affection, not old family wounds, but the future balance between tradition and authority. Who gets to decide the pace of change? Who speaks for continuity? Who gets heard when the institution must choose between public reassurance and private truth? Those questions do not need to be voiced aloud to generate conflict. In dynastic systems, they live beneath almost every major decision. At some point that evening, a draft statement was reportedly considered and then set aside. If true, that detail explains almost everything. A statement is what an institution issues when it believes clarity will reduce damage. Silence is what it chooses when clarity may create new damage of its own. Royal fans understood that instinctively. The absence of explanation did not lower the temperature, it raised it. Inside the palace, dinner proceeded, or at least the outward form of dinner did. Trays moved, doors opened and closed softly, lamps were lowered in private sitting rooms. But anyone mistaking the continuation of routine for the absence of crisis would have misunderstood how this family survives. Routine is not proof of peace. In royal life, routine is armor. Late in the night, one final development deepened the sense that whatever had happened was not finished. A car left by a secondary gate, not the main route used for public visibility. It was seen only briefly, enough to confirm movement, but not enough to settle who was inside. That fleeting image became the perfect symbol of the day, just enough to intensify the mystery, never enough to resolve it. And so the palace entered the small hours carrying two parallel realities. One was visible and polished, all continuity and calm. The other moved in shadow, shaped by private decisions whose consequences had not yet reached daylight. Royal fans were desperate for answers because they sensed the gap between those realities widening. And when that gap widens inside a palace, the next morning rarely brings relief. It brings revelation. Morning arrived without the release people had hoped for. If anything, the palace looked more disciplined, more polished, and therefore more revealing. The gates opened on schedule, staff appeared in place, vehicles came and went with the usual precision, yet the entire scene carried the brittle quality of something held together by will rather than ease. Royal fans watching from outside and online understood the signal immediately. The night had not solved the problem, it had only dressed it. The first official movement of the day should have settled nerves. Instead, it sharpened them. A planned appearance remained on the calendar, but the atmosphere around it felt stripped of its usual confidence. Senior aides checked details twice. Messages were relayed in shorter, tighter phrases. Even the photographers stationed at distance noticed that people were looking not toward the crowd, but toward doorways and windows, as if waiting for one final decision to be made at the very last moment. Then came the appearance itself, and with it the smallest of deviations. To most viewers, the scene looked intact. The cars arrived, the officials stepped forward, the order of movement broadly held. But for anyone familiar with royal staging, the changes were impossible to miss. One figure entered seconds later than expected. Another paused before stepping into view, not out of confusion, but as though adjusting to a revised arrangement. The spacing between them was correct by protocol and wrong by instinct. That is often how palace strain first reaches daylight, not through disorder, but through over-control. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Questions that had swirled abstractly the day before suddenly attached themselves to physical evidence. Why did that exchange look so careful? Why did one greeting seem colder than usual? Why was the usual soft ease replaced by something almost formal, almost defensive? The palace had hoped to project continuity. What it projected instead was effort. Inside the building, sources of tension were reportedly multiplying rather than narrowing. Part of the difficulty, it seemed, was not just what had happened behind closed doors, but who believed the matter should remain there. Some favored the traditional approach, absorb the shock privately, restore appearances quickly, and never allow passing strain to become a public rupture. Others, according to the growing speculation, believed the silence had already become part of the story. Once the public senses concealment, concealment itself becomes the crisis. That dilemma cut to the heart of royal survival. Monarchies do not function on openness alone, but neither can they live indefinitely on controlled mystery. They need enough distance to preserve dignity and enough clarity to preserve trust. When those needs collide, every face, every gesture, every delayed word begins doing work it was never meant to do. By mid-morning, the palace seemed trapped inside exactly that collision. What made the situation even more combustible was the possibility that the issue was not merely emotional, but structural. If private conversations had touched on responsibility, influence, or the future conduct of senior roles, then any temporary tension could quickly harden into something larger. Royal households can absorb personal disappointment. They struggle when disagreement begins reaching the architecture of the institution itself. That is when every aide becomes careful, every phrase becomes strategic, and every silence begins to sound intentional. Shortly before noon, a second internal meeting was reportedly convened, smaller than the first and more selective. That detail spread fast because it implied narrowing circles of confidence. In ordinary times, broad consultation signals stability. Narrow consultation signals sensitivity. Fans did not know who was in the room, what was said, or whether agreement was reached, but they did not need those specifics to feel the shift. The palace was no longer simply managing an uncomfortable moment. It was deciding what kind of future relationship that moment would produce. Outside, commentators and viewers did what they always do when institutions refuse clarity. They read symbols. A delayed departure became meaningful. A shortened exchange became meaningful. Even the absence of a certain familiar warmth became meaningful. Some of that interpretation was surely exaggerated, but not all of it. Repeated symbolism is rarely accidental in a system built on symbolism. And then, just when the palace most needed a smooth afternoon, came the moment that transformed concern into full obsession. It was brief, almost too brief to matter, except that it mattered instantly. As one senior royal turned after a formal exchange, another did not follow with the expected shared movement. The separation lasted only a few seconds before protocol closed the gap, but the cameras had already caught it. Within minutes, the image was everywhere, not because it proved scandal, but because it captured the emotional geometry of the entire crisis: outward order, inward distance. From that moment on, the question changed again. People were no longer asking whether something had happened behind palace doors. They were asking whether the people at the center of it were already living with consequences neither side could fully conceal. And if that was true, then the palace was not protecting a passing disagreement. It was protecting a turning point. By late afternoon, a harder truth was beginning to settle over the story. Answers were not being withheld because they did not exist. Answers were being withheld because, once spoken plainly, they might confirm that the family's calm exterior had been covering a deeper contest over trust, influence, and the right to shape what comes next. For royal fans, that possibility was irresistible and unsettling in equal measure, because if the doors had closed on a private clash of feeling, the palace could recover. But if they had closed on a struggle over power, then what the public had witnessed was not the aftermath of one difficult conversation. It was the opening scene of a much larger royal reckoning. And the unsettling part was this: everyone inside seemed to know the script had changed, while everyone outside was left studying expressions, waiting for the next crack. By nightfall, the palace finally gave the public what it had refused all day, not an explanation, but a picture. The image was carefully chosen, almost too carefully, and that was precisely why it mattered. There they were visible together, composed beneath the glow of formal lighting, each expression measured, each gesture controlled, each detail arranged to suggest continuity. To some viewers it worked, to others it confirmed everything. When unity has to be staged so precisely, people do not stop asking questions, they ask harder ones. The statement that followed was brief, restrained, and polished to the point of opacity. It spoke of ongoing duties, private discussions, mutual respect, and the importance of remaining focused on service. Nothing in it was dramatic, nothing in it was careless, yet the omission at its center was impossible to miss. It did not say that nothing had happened, it simply refused to name what had. For loyal supporters, that was enough to steady the mood for a moment. For devoted royal watchers, it was fuel, because by then the mystery had grown beyond one closed-door exchange. What fascinated people was no longer a single unseen conversation, but the larger possibility it represented. If something serious enough to alter schedules, expressions, access, and internal rhythms could happen without ever being plainly acknowledged, what else had been absorbed into the palace walls over the years? How many important turning points in modern royal life had first arrived like this, not with public rupture, but with subtle displacement, careful language, and smiles that no longer reached the eyes? Inside the institution, the immediate storm may have been softened by protocol, discipline, and the ancient instinct to close ranks when the outer world becomes too curious. But some changes do not disappear simply because they are managed well. They settle into relationships. They reappear in timing, influence, confidence, and the silent arithmetic of who is heard first when the next difficult moment arrives. That may be the true reason royal fans remain so unsettled. They sensed that whatever happened behind those doors did not end when the doors reopened. And perhaps that is why this story has gripped so many people. Not because the public expects perfect families in palaces, but because monarchy survives on the promise that symbolism still means something. Calm must mean calm, smiles must mean unity, appearances must mean order. The moment people suspect those symbols are under strain, fascination turns into obsession, because the palace is no longer just presenting a family, it is defending an idea. So the official image did what it was designed to do. It slowed the panic. It restored a measure of poise. It reminded the world that the palace still understands performance better than almost anyone alive. But it did not answer the deeper question. It left behind the one thought royal fans could not shake. If everything is truly fine behind palace doors, why did the silence feel so loud in the first place?